Welcome to Bible Study, Parody, and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel. Today we are doing a first for this show, and that is interviewing someone. Specifically, we are interviewing Sebastien Doane, Professor of Biblical Studies at the University of Laval in Quebec City, Quebec. Did I get that right?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the invitation, Bert.
Dr. Doane is a listener of this podcast.
Kind of fan.
And I'm honored by that. Dr. Doane contacted me through Twitter to let me know that. And since he is doing academic work on the Gospel of Matthew, I asked him where I could read his work, and he sent me to links to some papers that he has written in English. Most of his work is in French. And although I struggled to understand some of the academic verbiage, I found a lot of resonances with what I have been doing in this podcast, but also some dimensions of his work that go beyond what I'm doing. And ironically, irony and parody being one of the things I'm always looking for, ironically, I think, even though it's very academic work and not always easy to understand by lay readers such as myself, his work may hold some keys as to how to apply the text of Matthew in terms of personal and communal transformation. In other words, entering into a transformative relationship with the text. He has published many papers, one of which we will discuss in this interview. His dissertation was on the first two chapters of Matthew, and we will be discussing some of his ideas in that work. He has also published a book entitled Zombies, Unicorns, Cannibals, Strange Tales from the Bible, published by Paulist Press. And I want to read the description of that book from the Paulist Press website. It reads, "Was Jerusalem the scene of an invasion of zombies? Do unicorns frolic in the books of the Bible? Moreover, are there cannibals, a donkey that speaks, a son that refuses to continue its journey? This book answers these questions and many others that a reader may be asking while browsing this amazing book that is the Bible. By digging up the most disheveled and sometimes least well-known accounts of the Old and New Testaments, not only does Sebastien Doane introduce us to colorful passages, but he also leads us to become better readers of the biblical texts. His simple and humorous approach restores the desire to frequent the Scriptures." Anyway, welcome, Sebastien Doane. Did I get all of that right, or is there anything you would like to add by way of introduction?
No, that's perfect. Thanks, Bert. And yeah, I do have this way of working that comes from my interaction in pastoral work with youth, with teens. And to talk about the Bible, you have to find an interesting angle. And once you're in there talking about something that's kind of weird, well, they get interested in it and they get to know the Bible better. And well, now that I'm more in academia, I continue to be interested in the more marginal stuff that's happening in our biblical texts.
Yes, your background is in youth work and also radio, right?
Yeah. I've worked in communications, but my main language is French, so I might seem a little bit weird to listen to in English, but I think I'll manage.
You sound perfect, and your background gives you unique insights into the biblical texts. You are fully academically engaged. That's very evident from your papers.
I got all the footnotes.
Yeah, the footnotes. Those are important, and those footnotes seal the deal. But you also have this background of interacting and really connecting with people in the real social world, which has given you particular insights into the text. So I've got basically three big questions, so let's jump into those and see where that goes. First question. In episode 1, I proposed the idea of trickster texts that seem to be saying one thing but are actually saying another, sometimes the opposite of what they first appear to be saying. So I suggested that the genealogy in Matthew deconstructs itself. You talk about self-consuming texts and suggest that Matthew's genealogy is one of them. I think we're saying much the same thing, but your concept is more dynamic because it involves an ongoing process and involves the transformation of the reader. Can you explain this concept and how it overlaps with what I say in episode 1 and how it is different or goes beyond what I was saying?
So the concept that you're talking about that I use to better understand the genealogy is a self-consuming artifact. That concept comes from a professor called Stanley Fish. He used to be in the literary world. Now he's in more of the legal professor. But his concept is basically, he looks at literature that at the same time says something and asserts something else completely and leads the reader befooled. What do we do with this text? So his concept, the self-consuming artifact, is to say that the text consumes itself. It guides the reader to understanding something and then abandons this perspective completely. And at the same time, the reader's self is also consumed, because we were reading with the text, we were going in one direction, and that's discarded. And at the same time, we're invited to discard something of ourselves to go somewhere else with the text. And I think that's what's happening in the genealogy, specifically with the numbers of generations. I don't know if well, you talk about that in your first episode in the genealogy. There, verse 17, there's a recap that puts everything in three groups. From Abraham to David, from David to the exile, from the exile to Jesus, and says that there's 14 generations in all of these three segments. But if we read back and we actually count the numbers of egenesen, the Greek word for fathered this guy, there's only 13 of them in the first group and in the last group. For the first group, we say, well, maybe it's, Abraham's own birth should count, so we don't really, it doesn't cause so much of a problem. But then the last group, we're like, well, there's definitely a generation missing here. What do we do with that? And scholars have gone crazy on this. I've read through dozens and dozens of solutions to this problem. Should we count twice David, because his name appears twice in the genealogy? Should we count twice Jeconiah? His name also appears twice in the genealogy, but it's the same character. It's not another generation, so that doesn't really make sense. Other people would say, well, it's just a mistake, or Matthew's working with some, but if we say that, there's so many things that don't work in the Bible. If we just say, well, that's a mistake, we're not really doing any scholarship at all. We're not being intelligent. Some people say, well, maybe it's a different way of counting. Maybe Matthew's fluid in his counting. This name can go with this group and then with that group. Or there's been other possibilities. Maybe we should count Jesus one time and the risen Christ another time, or count Mary, or count Jesus's unknown father, if he has one, a human father, or count God as Jesus's father, and that it's not named, but it should be the other generation that's not pointed to, or the Holy Spirit, or whatever. We plugged in different answers to fill this problem and say, okay, we got a solution. Now we can continue reading on. My point is that the important thing is to experience the problem. It's not about finding a solution. It's about getting into this problem and saying, whoa, this is not working in a literal way. It's like there's a wink from the author to us that says, this is Jesus's genealogy. But did you see just what I did? This genealogy, doesn't quite work. There's a lot of irony in it, as you said. One could even say it's like a satire, a parody of a genealogy. If you would make, if you would just want to make a glorified genealogy for Jesus, it would be really easy to do, and you would just take the great moments of Israel. But at the same time, this is not what Matthew chose to do. He put forth the exile, the worst moment in the history, and the other turning point is David, and specifically, it talks about David having fathered Solomon by the wife of Uriah. So it points out to the worst moment and says, okay, Jesus is in the lineage of David, but this David, he did something that's pretty weird. It doesn't point to the David that's the shepherd in Bethlehem, or the unified kingdom king. No, it's the David who committed adultery or even rape and murder. So it sets up Jesus as son of David, but at the same time, it tells us, well, he won't be that kind of king. And so the same thing is true in the number of generations. He also skips 3 kings in the Old Testament list. And so an attentive reader, when he notices the number of generations, he sees, well, this is not something you have to take literally. It's a construct. It's a literary construct, and it's telling us something about Jesus. And what it's telling us is that this Jesus is not King Herod, basically. He's not the official king in Jerusalem. He's somebody from the outsides. There's women in there. There's foreigners. There's unknown people. The last third of the list of the genealogy after the exile, we don't have a clue who they are. And it's the same thing with Jesus. He pops up from a family of unknown people. So there's a lot of ironic stuff happening in this genealogy. And my paper that you read points to the number of generations, which is, for my part, one of the most obvious problems. And it says, well, let's not try to find a solution as the other exegetes try to do. Let's see what is this text, what is it doing, and to experience this problem, and to experience it to better read what's following. So, and I really enjoy what you do with your podcast, because it's like you saw that wink from the author in the first chapter, and it helps you for the rest of the gospel to read it with an eye out for everything that's ironic, everything that's all the reversals, because ultimately at the end, there's the ultimate reversal of everything. Jesus dies, but it doesn't end there. He's resurrected. He's risen. So, and this reversal, this complete reversal, makes for that all of the story tries to open the reader to other reversals that sets up this main reversal of the whole gospel story. Because, nobody was waiting for a crucified Messiah. The Messiah, a King David Messiah, would have just, risen up an army and put the Romans away and build back a kingdom like there was before. We see this in other texts. There's other texts from other sources in the Bible about this region, and like the Psalms of Solomon and Qumran text, where we see that there's these messianic expectations that, if you want Jesus to be a Messiah, have to be reversed. So the genealogy in Matthew starts that. It says, well, Jesus, right from the first verse, Jesus is pointed to as Messiah, but at the same time, it reverses everything. So we get to understand that Jesus can be a Messiah in another way.
Now, you say that the author of Matthew gives the audience a wink to let them know that there's something ironic going on here. But there are some commentators and scholars who resist that sort of reading because they don't think that ancient writers had the ability to do that, to give that wink, to write irony or parody. But from what I can tell, ancient writers did engage in parody. I mean, there's Apuleius and the Golden Ass, for instance. Can you speak to the ability of ancient writers to give that wink, to write parody?
Of course. And we see this in a lot of the Greco-Roman rhetorics. They speak to all the different kinds of irony there was. Quintilian was a famous rhetoric who defined irony and Plato used it, and so it's not something that's out of context. And even in the basic text of the biblical text, we have different forms of irony. In Mark's version of the Passion, Jesus just in Gethsemane, twice he tells the disciples, "Okay, wake up, guys! Don't sleep. There's something very important that's happening." And they go to sleep a third time. And finally, he says, "Okay, rest. That's not important. So what's happening here?" Obviously, that's ironic. He couldn't change his opinion and tell the disciples to rest. Irony is used. It's a form it's a literary form that helps make a point. But what I think makes that we don't see it that much in Matthew is that Matthew was the most read, most commented gospel throughout history, the church fathers and so forth, because it was considered the first gospel for so long, up until the 19th century. So we have this classical way of interpreting Matthew because it's the one that was interpreted in that way. And since the 19th century, well, Mark was rediscovered because then, we have this Markan priority thing going. So to get back closer to Jesus, we're studying Mark. So everybody's interested in Mark, and we see the ironic reversals in Mark. We see some also in John's gospel, a lot of irony going on in John's gospel. But the Matthean scholarship has not been that much renewed because scholarly interest has gone elsewhere, and we're still using old interpretive ways, classical. They're not bad. They're not geared to seeing the text in the way you present it in your podcast. I think there's a renewal of the scholarship on Matthew that's happening, and it's normal. We're in this persuasive arena where we have to show that my reading has something to bring forth, and I don't think it cancels other readings. It's just it brings forth some other way of looking at that text.
In your paper, when you talk about self-consuming texts or artifacts, you talk about reading them and the process around that as an ongoing process that transforms the person or the community. Can you speak more to that?
For sure. For Stanley Fish, which I talked about, who's the one behind this self-consuming artifact thing, more largely, he's interested not so much in what authors wanted to say. That would be a more historical approach, or what's the structure of the text in itself. He's more interested in the relationship between the text and the readers, and to be more accurate, about the reading experience as it is. So for Stanley Fish, the importance is not the 2,000-year-old text. It's the experience that's happening right now. What's happening when I'm reading verse 1:1 of Matthew? What's happening when I'm going to verse 2? Even more so, what's happening when I'm going from the fourth word to the fifth word? Is there some meaning that's happening in my head, and then, whoops, I have to go back and change something? Or the meaning is not just what happens at the end of the book. We're constantly evolving from word to word as we shift through the pages. So Stanley Fish's work brings us glasses to read the Bible as an experience. And I think that the biblical text, specifically the Gospels, are meant to be transformative literature. They're not just it's not an archaeological thing to keep hold of what happened. It's to transform the readers. It's to help us, discover that in life we have to help our neighbors, that God is there, that all the important things in the text is not about the text, it's about real life. So I think the biblical text have us, the gospel specifically, in Matthew in particular, wants us to read it, yes, but to read it as an experience and as a transformative experience, so that it changes our worldview and that it changes us as well. Yeah, and I think we have to better unify what we're doing. When I'm with my colleagues, other professors in a classroom, or these days on Zoom, we're doing something that's quite different than what we're doing when we're in a reading group in our church, or what we're doing when I'm reading the Bible with my wife or kids. But it's the same text. Why couldn't we do things a little differently? Make more, make this biblical reading more grounded. What I read about and talk about at the university shouldn't be that different than what I do in my church and in my family life and in my real life. I think it all has to inform each other. Better biblical scholarship should produce better Christians, and better Christians should also help better understand the text. We shouldn't have this separation that sometimes I see a little too acute.
Yeah, and I think that the biblical text should upset our world. And if it isn't, we're not reading it honestly. And that, I think, includes the mistakes. That there are not 14 generations in that section, there are 13, and that Rahab is in the wrong century, and that different biblical writers might disagree with each other. I mean, let's be honest about this. If we really revere the Bible, pretending that these things are not there is not doing the Bible or God any favors. Being honest about what it is, being honest about it, that's, I think, what we owe the text and what we owe God. I mean, I've come to the conclusion that I'd rather people be honest about the Bible, even if that means they come to the conclusion that they aren't a Christian anymore, because in being honest, we are free to really hear the text. Only then does it have a chance of impacting us and changing us, regardless of how we self-identify.
And this text from Matthew, it sometimes fascinates me, but also takes the rug under from my feet. When I read the chapter 5 and 6, when he speaks about money, well, I like to have a bank account and put money away from when I get older, and I'm owner of a house, and I can look at the lilies of the prairies and the birds. They don't need to do all that, and God's providing for them, but I'll provide for myself. Thank you very much. So when I read this text, I see that it has a different point of view than mine, that it's challenging me, and that if I would be a 100% gospel Christian who would follow what was in the text, I would have to change my way of life completely. And honestly, I don't have the guts to do it right now. And I probably won't do it for a while, but I have the honesty to recognize that the text is different than me. Sometimes we love to see the biblical text as mirrors of ourselves. We unconsciously project ourselves in the mirror, and we see a Jesus that looks very much like us. But no, and one of the big differences is that the first century Christians that wouldn't call themselves Christians anyway, but the first century followers of Jesus, they were in a very marginal place. They were not in charge of a society with thousands of people going to a church who had influence on the laws of the empire. And no, they're a marginal group. They're marginal within the empire, but they're marginal within Judaism. But when we don't have any marginality in our own identity, when we're Christian, white, American, and United States, well, you don't have that marginal experience that the followers of Jesus would have. So it explains for a lot of the misreadings that we might have, or not getting to what the text is talking about.
Yeah, we have this tendency to read the text as if it's a 21st century North American text. But we are not in the same place as Christians in the first century. I have, to a very safe degree, in very safe ways, I've resisted the empire. For example, I don't pledge the U.S. American flag. And sometimes when people ask me about that, I hide behind my Anabaptist Mennonite connection and say, I'm Mennonite, so it's against my religion. But really, it's because I know what the U.S. has done abroad, invading other countries, overthrowing democratically elected governments from Guatemala to Iran to Haiti, not to mention what we've done to the poor and people of color within our own borders. And I feel that the gospel compels me to face this truth and not to pledge allegiance to a country that does that, and not to prioritize my country, whatever the case, over other countries, my people over other people. So I've resisted, but I haven't really suffered for it. You know, I just try to follow Matthew 25.
Matthew 25, well, ultimately, salvation is about what you did to your brother that's poor, that's in prison, that's naked, that's thirsty, that's hungry. That's the ultimate checkpoint in Matthew's gospel. And there are different ways of seeing soteriology in the New Testament, but what it is to be saved in Matthew is quite explicit and quite concrete. And when I read that, I'm always surprised, and I'm always like, okay, well, am I really saved? I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Right.
And it's sometimes more I read the Bible, more I see myself as a Pharisee that needs to be converted, and that's why I read the Gospels, because it still has to transform me. So I read it as a scholar, but I also read it as a real human being who wants to better understand his place in this world.
Yeah, I may have resisted, but I really haven't taken up the cross as an enemy of the empire. You know, that language in Matthew, taking up the cross, is only slightly metaphorical. When Jesus says that, he does mean for his disciples to make themselves enemies of the empire, people that the empire wants to crucify, wants to execute. I haven't gone that far yet. I haven't done anything that has put a target on my back, that has caused the U.S. government to want to come after me. So, am I really saved? Am I really a Christian? Now, speaking of Pharisees, one of the episodes on this podcast, I can't remember which one, but one of the episodes, I make the suggestion that the author of Matthew perhaps was a Pharisee.
Yeah, and if not, there's a lot of discussion about Jesus. Was he a Pharisee or not? When you read Matthew, there's a fierce opposition, chapter 23, with the Pharisees. But like Cain and Abel, you oppose yourself to whom's closest to you. You don't, they don't talk about, I don't know, Canadians. They don't even know Canadians. They don't care about Canadians, but they care about who's right next to them, and in which there's a tension. And more and more we're reading Matthew within Judaism. Matthew is a Jewish text that speaks about Jewish people who follow Jesus as Christ and their struggles with Jewish people who don't follow Jesus as Christ. And they're in interpretive battles about how to interpret the Sabbath and all sorts of stuff. But there's a shift in it. We're no longer reading Matthew like this Christian text written in a Christian society. No, it's not. It's in a context very different from ourselves, and we're trying to get into it. And what if Jesus was close to this Pharisee world? What if the disciples were close to what is named the Pharisees? And how do they distinguish themselves from that? And what you mentioned about the persecution, it's clear when in chapter 10, 11, when Jesus is sending the disciples on mission, there is a lot of persecution going on. So we don't have a very good idea who exactly was the author and what exactly was his situation. But there was certainly some persecution going on, and it was certainly a difficult thing to say you're a Christian and to be on the road proclaiming the gospel. And what you said earlier on speaks to that. Maybe we should be a little more uncomfortable. Well, maybe we should also maybe we should be a little more literal about our reading of Matthew and actually go on the roads to speak about Christ, or on Zoom or on podcasts. So I think there's definitely a difference between the context of the first century and our context, but there's also stuff that helps us bridge between those two different contexts and see that we have similar struggles, but at the same time we have to be critical about everything. See, is this really in the text? Is this really about me, about my reading of the text? What's happening there?
Now, the reason that I suggested that the author of Matthew was a Pharisee is that he writes in pretty good Greek, so he's probably not a peasant. He's probably a scribe, because only a scribe could write like that. So he's from the retainer class, the professional class that worked for the upper classes. And that's what many of the Pharisees were. They were part of the retainer class, many of them scribes. And Matthew pairs them with scribes, always pairs them with scribes, as if they are one cohort. So I think that he was a scribe and a Pharisee. And some Pharisees defected from their class and joined peasant movements, such as Zadok the Pharisee, who joined Judas of Galilee in an uprising in Galilee against the Romans when Jesus was a child. I think that the author of Matthew was a scribe who defected from his class to join the Jesus movement, a peasant movement, and his part in the movement was to write one of the versions of the story of Jesus.
Yeah, and at the specific, first century in Galilee, and when you go a little further to the north and to the south as well, there's a lot of stuff happening in the first century. A lot of violence, a lot of military repression, economic repression, and you can't. It's impossible to argue for a neutral gospel, the gospel as a religious text that has no economic or agenda at all, and that Jesus is just it's not possible. In 70, we suppose Matthew was composed around 80 or something like that, but in 70 there's this horrible war. The Jerusalem's temple is burning, and people are dying and leaving, and we suppose maybe Matthew's community had to move, or some of the Christians had to move and get out of this violence, and so it's a world. It's a rough world, and so that I think the text speaks to that, and that we have to have that in our heads too. It's not meant for Sunday preaching at all in a nice, comfortable church. These are people who who lived life and death issues. The second chapter, Jesus has to go all the way to Egypt. Joseph and Mary and baby Jesus have to go all the way to Egypt to escape death. I think that speaks about this community too, who maybe had to escape this violence. It's the only gospel that talks about this early on trip. So I think that there's we can't pinpoint exactly geographically and where this happens, but we see that there's struggles that are happening, and where are you in those struggles? You have to be with the person that's dying, that's sick, that's in prison, that's hungry. So these people actually exist. The Beatitudes, it's all about that too. So it's all over in Matthew, and I think that we need to open our eyes to understanding the gospel in another way. See, it wasn't written for a nice reading today in my comfortably sitting in a chair. No, it's a life and death thing that's surprising us, and that's saying there is life where there should be death. Even if you encounter the most horrible stuff, well, God is there in that horrible stuff, and we'll be there together. And you know what? There's light behind that. There's a resurrection that's happening. So, of course, my paper is very technical, and that's academic stuff. But I think it's also grounded in a reading of the gospel that's has something religious, but not in the clouds religious, but something that in which religion and spirituality can get us to get to be better humans in the worst circumstances, if we have to deal with them, or when we deal with them.
Yes, the story in Matthew takes place in a very different world, and that makes it harder for us to find ourselves in it. But that's why I have my theory about the author of Matthew being a Pharisee who defected from his movement to be in sympathy with this peasant movement. Because for many of us, that's the guy most like us. We're not actually in the story. We're like the guy who wrote the story. Those of us who are educated, not upper class, but comfortable and educated, yet in sympathy with movements for a more egalitarian society, in sympathy with people who don't have the privilege we have. We're that guy. We're like the author of Matthew. Now, I do want to get to that paper that you recently published on the Magi, seeing that it's right before Christmas here that we're doing this interview. You've just published a paper on the story of the Magi's interaction with Herod in Matthew 2, as portrayed in the film by Pier Paolo Pasolini. That film's title is The Gospel According to Matthew. Can you describe your ideas in that paper and how it illumines the text for us?
Sure. So as what I do is I take, literary concepts and use them to better understand the what's happening in the Gospels. In this paper, I use one literary concept, but also the movie that you mentioned, Matthew by Pasolini. So the concept comes from Mikhail Batkin. Batkin is a Russian who studied literary stuff, and he used the Carnivalesque. Carnivalesque is he used the carnivals in medieval period to understand literature. So he would look for in books what happens in a carnival, laughter, reversal, grotesque, and kind of a renewal that goes against the official power. Because in the carnival, the people can do whatever they want, and those who are kings were not, and those who are not kings, well, we would elect a king from who was a nobody. So I used Mikhail Batkin's Carnivalesque to do a reading of Matthew 2. Matthew 2 is with the whole Magi coming over, and in that chapter, I think that the powerful, like Herod, actually seem helpless and completely foolish. They're the fools of the carnival. And they're like buffoons, actually. Herod wants to kill Jesus, but ultimately he's the one who dies. And you have these figures like the Magi, who are figures of popular wisdoms. They interpret signs, they outwit the Arturian powers. Even Joseph and his family, they also outwit the powers. And everything is set up to find a king that's different, a different king who's completely vulnerable, and he's from the people, not a ruler. He's of the people. So from the very beginning of the gospel, there's an opposition that generates a critique against the political and religious powers, and that builds the kingship of Jesus in an antithesis to Herod. He's the exact opposite. And I use the film from Pasolini to show, Pasolini, he was he proclaimed homosexual, atheist, but also very interested in the Gospels. And he did this whole movie on Matthew's Gospel being the most literal possible. But he has different wings also in his way of portraying Matthew too, that shows that he also has this Carnivalesque reading of the Gospel. It's not about a religious experience of kneeling in front of Jesus as adoring your Savior. No, when you have these emissaries from some other countries that come and don't kneel in front of Herod, don't give him gifts, but kneel in front of Jesus and give him gifts, there's a clear political statement there. And it's a very ironic statement and a very subversive statement towards Herod and that kind of kingship. See, he's not the real king at all. There's a very clear opposition between the two ways of being king, and that's something that I think we have to pay attention very closely, because we have this tendency as Christians as putting Jesus up as the king, and he is the king that's, he's the greatest. He's the greatest. He would have been the greatest emperor of them all. He would have been the greatest president of them all. No, he's not. That's not it at all. He's the opposite of that. He's the vulnerable child. He's the one who's going to be crushed by the king. But the Magi orient us to see that he actually is the one that we have to follow. And at the end of the gospel, chapter 28, at the end, chapter 28, verses 20, the readers are invited to take the same posture as the Magi. The disciples kneel in front of the resurrected Christ. So for the disciples, they needed to have that whole gospel story to get to where the Magi were in chapter 2. And I think we as readers are invited to take the same stance, to kneel in front of him. But let's see, what are we doing when we kneel in front of Christ? And when the disciples do it in the last chapter, they do it, and some had doubts. So doubting is also part of kneeling. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in all that, but faith and doubt are not opposition. They go together at the end of Matthew's gospel. So to be better Christians, maybe we should have better faith, but also better doubt. Right. I just find it interesting to see that there's a clear connection between the beginning and the end of this gospel text. So yeah, I'm sure you're going to put forth lots of reversals at the end of with the passion, the resurrection story. Right. There's a lot of this happening again. So right from the get-go, the text tells us, watch out, something's completely wrong here. We're changing everything around.
Well, that's a spoiler. Yeah, that goes to the very end of Matthew. But yeah, you're right. That's the last thing we hear about the disciples, is that some of them doubted. That's the very last thing we hear, that they worshiped Jesus after the resurrection, and some of them doubted. That's the very last thing. So there you have a spoiler for probably our last episode, which we won't get around to for a long time. So maybe you'll forget it before then. But let's leave it there. That's a good place to end it. A good place to end this interview. Thanks so much, Dr. Sebastien Doane, for coming on this podcast and sharing your insights with us and your affirmation of what I'm doing on this podcast. And as usual, my name is Bert Newton. This has been a special episode of Bible Study, Parody and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel. And as usual, I invite you to spread the word, to rate us on Apple Podcast and Stitcher and wherever else they let you do that. Give us an actual review if you can. That makes me feel really good. And it draws people. And you can make a donation through PayPal to subversivewisdom@gmail.com. That's where you send it, subversivewisdom@gmail.com. You can also use that email address to ask me questions. You can send me questions or comments, whatever, and that's at subversivewisdom@gmail.com. And so, we'll leave it there. And there'll be some new regular episodes in the new year. So look out for those in the new year. I'm working on them now. Until then, have a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays.